And there is a man who knows all about feeding birds, who provides a wonderful variety of bird seed, who knows birds, who ought to be called Mr. Bird, but instead of that, he's called Nicholas Watts. Nicholas.
Yes, thank you, Robin, for those kind words. Yes, well, I farm in the Fens, somewhere about where the letter D of the Welland is. It's only about 1.5 meters above sea level. But, of course, I was in the late 70s and early 80s, I was doing bird surveys for the Lincolnshire Bird Club and for the British Trust for Ornithology. But none of those surveys were on my farm. And so I thought, well, it's time I did a survey on my farm. And I went down the farm with a map and a pen and binoculars and recorded everything I saw and heard. That is a simple map just showing the singing skylarks and the singing corn buntings. I didn't do much with those records for a start, but then one wet summer's afternoon in 1992, I started to work out how things were. You can see on the right-hand side, there's only 14 singing skylarks and 1 singing corn buntings, while on the left-hand side, there's over 30 singing skylarks and 12 singing corn buntings. Well, that worried me. I wondered what had happened, really. Well, the farmer on the left side had given up farming. A younger man took the job on. And when a young man comes into farming, he brings lots of new ideas. And those new ideas are not usually very pleasant for wildlife. And also in that time, from the 60s to the 90s, the agrochemical industry had got into top gear. And in the 60s, we were only spraying our wheats with 1 herbicide, and sometimes an insecticide. But by the 1990s, we were spraying our wheat crops with 3 herbicides, 2 growth regulators, 2 insecticides, and 3 fungicides. And then we wonder where all the wildlife's got to. But that's how it was, and it worried me. I began to look back, see what had happened in the fen, and in 1955, there were all those cattle yards on that area. The scale of the map is, the squares on the map are 1 kilometre squares, as on every other Ordnance Survey map. But those cattle yards have gone, and so have the swallows. Swallows have declined in Deeping Fen, I think, in the last 60 years by 90%, because swallows like to live on flies around farm animals. And of course, sprays. Well, in the early days, 20-foot or 30-foot sprayers, block nozzles and not very good chemicals. But today, 24-meter or even 36-meter booms. And the person who drives the sprayer has to have a test. The sprayer has to have an MOT, and the person who advises us to put the sprays on has to be trained and has his qualifications as well. So although they say that these sprays are a lot kinder to the environment, I think because we're so good at putting them on, I think they're just as bad for the environment. And then you get crops like this. And that's what farmers have been trying to do for generations, grow crops without weeds in. But if that is so, where are the birds going to get the insects to feed their young? The insects live on all the various plants there are, and they are there, and the birds use them to feed their young. Quite simply, the privet hawk moth its caterpillar will only feed on privet or on ash saplings. The common blue butterfly will only feed on bird's foot trefoil and 1 or 2 other trefoils. And of course, the cinnabar moth, which you all know, will only feed on ragwort or groundsel. So that, and the knotgrass beetle will only feed on knotgrass. So when there are no weeds in the crops, if those insects could eat our wheat or our crop, the agronomist would say spray it, but they can't. So we don't kill the insects, we actually starve the insects. And then so the skylark and the corn bunting and the yellow wagtail, they've got very little food for their young. Well, so this worried me so much, so I started organic farming, and as you can see here, this is the combine going through an organic field. You can see the weeds in the foreground, and a good range of weeds, so the birds are coming back. At the same time, we started to feed the birds in the farmyards because we didn't know quite what the problem was, but we knew that when we fed cattle, there was always birds around the cattle yards. And at that, we had an open day because we started feeding them. There were up to 800 birds came in that yard at any one time. So we had this open day, and at that open day, 2 or 3 people said, well, can you sell me any bird food? Oh, I said, I hadn't thought about that one. But I did. I sold them some oilseed rape. The next year, we had the same spectacle, up to 800 birds in the yard at any one time, and again, people asked me to sell them bird food. So there I was, selling bird food without even trying. We have tried a bit harder since. We have done various other things on the farm. First of all, we've had some wide grass margins, and then we've had these cultivated margins where we don't sow anything, we just let the weeds grow. But as my grandson reminds me, they're not weeds, Grandad, because that's where you want them to grow. A weed is a plant in the wrong place. The whitethroat comes from Africa, totally insectivorous. It likes to nest where the flail mower didn't get the year before, or where the vegetation last year wasn't cut down. It likes to attach its nest to the nettle stems or the cow parsley stems. So we don't use the flail mower very much, so we have more wildlife and we have less cost. It's a win-win situation. Well, the best a fen farmer can do really is to dig some ponds and plant a hedge on the north side of the ponds and have some flower meadows, and perhaps to the right of the ponds is another small flower meadow, and then on the right-hand side of that there's another hedge as well. So, and that's where we get all the wildlife from. So you've got the insects that live in water and come out of water, you've got the insects that live on the hedges, and you've got the insects that are on the wildflowers. So that's where you've got the maximum amount of insects, so that's where you get the maximum amount of bird life. And the bird boxes are tree sparrow boxes, and of course the brick tower is for barn owls. And that's where 6 species can nest in that tower. On this bottom side, a mallard lays its eggs, and its young tipple out of the tower onto the ground. A stock dove then takes that space up, a jackdaw in the top, and on the other side there's two entrances, so a barn owl and a kestrel nest in there. And then you can just see the tree sparrow boxes under the head. So that's 6 species that nest in that barn owl tower. But this year was not a year when barn owls would rear 7 young. As you've heard, lark rise, I'm afraid they've got the owls, but none of them bred. This year, they only produced between 1 and 3 youngsters, depending where they were. Normally, we have about 14 pairs nest on the farm, but this year we only had 10. There's another area where we have tree sparrow boxes, and they've done very well here. We've had 20 boxes up, and some of them have 4 broods a year. They're able to have 4 broods a year because they get fed. So that was in the early years, and then more tree sparrows came, so we put more feeders up. And more came, And you can still see they're waiting about. There's not enough room for them. And in 10 years, the tree sparrows have gone from 2 pairs to 150 pairs on my farm because they've got a surplus of food. The barn owls, when there's a lot of voles about, they have a big brood and sometimes a second brood. But when there's no voles, they don't breed or they only have 1s and 2s. So food is the driver. And it's fair to say that any species that is declining is running out of food at some time in the year or another. The linnet. Well, feeded oilseed rape, which I did do last year in a bramble patch, up to 200 linnets in this bramble patch about 900 yards from my house. Linnets can go at least a mile to take food back to their nest. And this year was the first time we'd had linnets nesting in the garden for 30 years. We had 3 pairs. So linnets and tree sparrows are quite easy. But yellowhammers, not quite so easy. They have a territory, but it's quite possible to increase them. So if we want to increase yellowhammer territories, they will come and eat with all the other birds in the winter. You can bring all the birds together in the winter, but when it comes to nesting time, they want to go back to their where they were bred or where they bred last year. And the female yellowhammer and the female cornbunting are very home-loving. They will only go back to where they were bred. And so, if we want to increase their numbers, we have to put a feeder in each yellowhammer territory and each cornbunting territory. Last year, I had feeders in about 20 yellowhammer territories, and so when I do my surveys this coming spring, I will be very interested to see whether I've increased their numbers. But that's the secret of getting more birds. They give them a surplus of food. Corn buntings, yes, very home-loving. The corn buntings come and sing on my farm, but then they go back to the core area because the girls won't come out to my farm. And that happens in the spring. And this year we had a lovely crop of red clover. Red clover, one of 15 crops that we grow. And there were 4 singing males on that farm, around the clover, but no girls came round to see them. Well, they might have come to see them, but they didn't come and nest there. Well, that's the drain at the bottom of my farm, and before 1980, it was mown twice a year. And I didn't like that idea. And so I got myself elected onto the drainage board. And at the second meeting I attended, I asked them if there was any necessity to mow this drain twice a year. They said there was. There were 25 other people at the meeting. But they did relent and say, we'll only mow it once a year. And as the chairman went out of the meeting, he said to the vice chairman, so the vice chairman told me a few years afterwards, he said, do you know, he said, I think we're going to have some trouble from this chap. But I haven't caused them any trouble. Now we only mow it one side each year. And we have a colony we have a wildlife corridor. On that far side, there's a pair of reed warblers' nests from this bridge up to the next bridge, which is up there, 2,800 yards away. There's a reed warbler's nest every 40 yards. And, well, there's a reed warbler's nest. It's one of the only birds that don't rest their nest on anything. They just let it, they sling it in the reeds, and they let it sway about in the reeds. But the cuckoo comes along. And that might be the scene one day, and a week later, that is the scene. 5 or 6 days earlier than that, the cuckoo has thrown or tumbled the reed warbler's nest eggs out of the nest. He's well equipped to do so because he's got a dimple in his back. And there is a young cuckoo with a reed warbler's nest on its back, its little wings outstretched, and it's blind. It's climbing up the nest backwards. Now, how could that have evolved? And how long would it taken to evolve? And I can remember my mother, when I was a lad, getting fed up with the cuckoo calling. So in my lifetime, cuckoos have gone from surplus to scarcity. And at that, the cuckoo was exhausted and it flopped back into the nest. 17 days later, it's got too big for the nest and it's sitting out in the reeds, still begging for food. And its parents are on their way to Africa, probably fattening up in the Po Valley before their huge journey across the Mediterranean and across the Sahara Desert. And most of them go down through Italy, and most of them come back via Gibraltar. And we could do that, now we've got sat-navs, couldn't we? But, you know, who has heard a cuckoo this year? Yes, some of you, not all of you, of course. But wildlife is amazing. We must look after it and teach others to look after it.
Well done, Nicholas. Excellent.